One of the interesting issues about the city is that it enables a gathering of enormously diverse people who may not necessarily be talking to each other, but who become present to each other. We cannot but notice. And that to me is a very special type of gathering. The kind of gathering that would happen in an office park with narrowly established rules, everything private and controlled, everybody doing their thing. That is a kind of gathering that I would say is not quite gathering, because it is just, all the professionals may have subject to talk about, issues they share, the cleaners may also, but it's not that kind of gathering that you find in a city. And in there also for me lies the whole question of the loss of habitat that is happening. So if you take a big patch of rural land, when you have smallholder agriculture, there is a gathering. They meet each other, they learn from each other, they assist each other, they are present to each other. It doesn't have to be a city. When you take a huge plantation, the workers are just an army of workers. They are not present to each other. They are, if anything, present to those who keep control and who have power over them. That's not a gathering. So a mass of people depends where it is. Those same people on a plantation, put them in a city, and they will stand there in a demonstration and say, we have the rights to have rights. Whereas if they do that on a plantation, they say, just go back to work or go back to your country, something like that. So I do think that the space where something happens is actually very important. Today, when you look at cities today, given the enormous amount of corporate buying, of building after building, and often replacing dense urban tissue, which is a bit messy, where an older person still sees a very old little building that they knew from their youth. Today, all of that is cut out, privatized, made into a mega project. And that means that's like the office park syndrome in a way. It also homogenizes those who control. When you take that to residential areas, we are actually losing density in these cities, because you have vaster spaces where before, you had a lot of families living in a certain kind of unit. Now you have one, or you have, it's just the use of space per individual. We have very precise figures for New York City, for instance, for Manhattan. There really is less density, even though the built environment looks more dense because we have all these high towers. But many of these people barely live in there. Many of those units are empty. They're like a way of storing your money. So that then brings a certain type of homogenizing that is also there you don't make presence to each other. I mean, what I love about a real city is that, the 150 nationalities that are living in that city, somehow they become present to each other. Many different ways of speaking Spanish and many different ways of speaking English, in the case of New York City, the Indian way. So that really dehomogenizes. You realize, oh my God, my Spanish is not quite like that of the Colombians. My English, me Indian, is not the English of the Brits, and that is what a city is meant to be, It is a bit of a vortex, and this notion of the incompleteness, this mixture of complexity and incompleteness, that is an open system that keeps on functioning, and to function it cannot push out all of those who are different. It has to work with that mix, with that complexity. It's very common for people to assume that finance is banking. Actually, the traditional bank, we all need a traditional bank. If I want to buy a bike so that I pollute the environment less, rather than using buses or whatever, I need a loan. We need loans. Traditional banking is fine. What we have today is this whole other sector, which is properly called finance. And finance is really not about banking and not about selling money. Finance, I think of finance as a capability. The reason it is a capability in my view, is that because it sells something it does not have, it has to invent incredibly complex instruments, and with those instruments invade other sectors, very high-level sectors and very modest sectors. It is really impressive capability that can actually pull out value from a very modest asset and escalate its value. So there you see the capability at work. When you then also take the value of finance as measured, which is a standard measure by outstanding capital, you get a figure that is many, many times bigger, 10 to 15 times bigger, it varies by the years, than the global GDP of all countries. Now, global GDP actually measures something, and that includes also immaterial goods and services, like accounting, advice, and all of that. But it's simply on another order of magnitude. So then you realize that what we call finance, it's something that we really have to take seriously. I also always say, if you want to understand finance, don't ask a financier, because they will give you finance in the language of finance, and then you are lost. And so all politicians fall into that trap, members of legislatures who should know better, and give you something about finance that who knows what they're talking about, When I look at finance's capability and I look at how can we make a positive out of this, or how can we really develop capacities to contain finance? On the one hand, finance makes capital. The question then becomes, how does it get used? We have vast needs. We have to clean up vast stretches of land and water bodies. We have to build housing. We have to build roads. We have et cetera, et cetera. So I say, well, let's bring it down and materialize it. For that, however, you need politicians and some financiers who see the importance of that project and are willing to move into it. Now, on the other hand, I am one of those who thinks that we need to relocalize whatever we can of the economy. So, out with franchises. Not a Starbucks. The only good thing about Starbucks is fair trade, coffee farmers, right? But find local talent. I tell my students at Columbia University, if you need shelf, table, they come in, go to the immigrant community and commission it. They will do it. They will bring it to your house, right? So how can urban agriculture is a good example. How can we relocalize whatever we can localize? Local currencies, critical. They're partial currencies. There are over 180 local currencies. Well, we need probably 1 million, if we're going to do local. Because that means you stay out of the banking system, out of the credit and interest rate system. You just function. And for me, again, these are first steps in trajectories that thicken the tissue of that neighborhood. I prefer the term neighborhood to community, because in neighborhood, frankly, many of these people hate each other, but they can work around very material instrumentalities. So one thing is the question of finance and how do we make it work for good, needed projects, but the more important thing is let's start to relocalize. Today, everything is a franchise. It takes away always, inevitably, part of the consumption capacity of a neighborhood, no matter how modest. It takes out. So you have gradual impoverishment, actually. Whereas if you set up your own, you have potential growth of profits, because other people will also come and spend their money in your locality. I mean, that's just one very simple example.